Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have not just an incredible episode, but a super incredible episode. A lot of people have been wondering and watching and waiting for this new episode over the past week. As you know, there's been kind of a little bit of a flame war going on Twitter, and as you guys all know, I love talking about my flame wars on Twitter and further elaborating on them on the podcast. And today is no exception. So today we're going to talk mainly about what I describe as the plumber option. I get the name from, if some of you guys have heard of the book by Roger, The Benedict Option, I think there's a better way of describing a new mindset and new strategy among a lot of right-wing. It's not just the people that we see on Twitter, but it also extends to boomer cons and a lot of other normie cons and definitely populist Inc. And I think the best way to describe this is the plumber option, not the Benedict option. And we will discuss that today. And so for those who've been watching my Twitter feed, you've been seeing a lot of people fighting over my takes and getting very mad. So there are two aspects of this mindset that I need to talk about that are separate and are deserving their own attention. And when I describe the plumber option, I think there are two strands of it. The first strand is the idea that rural America and rural Americans are a revolutionary class. That the potential for saving our country lies within rural America. The conflict we're going to engage in is going to be ruralite versus urbanite, and rural America has the ability to separate from the rest of America and potentially augur for a revolution, civil war, national divorce, whatever you want to call it. And that's where our hope lies. And also this goes along with the idea that rural America is free of most of the laws affecting the rest of America, and that's where you should live. So that's point one. And the second point is, and this is more directly a part of the plumber option, is that you need to drop out of college and any white collar work you have, and you need to adopt a trade and move out to rural America. You need to get the hell out of the cities. And this is less of political or more of like what they expect of like from the Revolution or Civil War, but just more life advice and how they think that we'll build power and independence in America is through everyone going to trade school, not going to college, and dropping out of the cities and moving to rural America. So these are the two mindsets that you're working with. And some people might be like, well, this is straw manning, blah, blah, blah. Like, no, these are really what some people are describing. And by the strategy that is some people talking about, there's one with why you should go to rural America. There's one with the collapse that's going to come. And the only place that's going to survive the collapse is rural America, which some people like expect to nuclear apocalypse happening, every urbanite starving to death and coming to beg the rural homesteaders for support. And, them not giving that support or like enslaving urbanites. I'm not quite sure what the plan is, but it's an expectation of collapse. Or there's this idea that, the rural America is going to rise up against the rest of America and take power. Maybe in a type of collapse situation, but, it's not quite Mad Max. There's still functioning system of some sort going on, and that they take over, or they just split off and they take their states with them, and they surround the cities and starve them to death. That all that lighthearted stuff that's going on there. A lot of it's very misanthropic. It's imagining some of these like crazy wignats in the day who had these like really bizarre sadistic fantasies about race war and stuff, but now it's just like they have these bizarre and sadistic fantasies about urbanites. And urbanites apply to anyone, or bugmen apply to anyone working a white collar job, and that may live in an area that has more than 20,000 people. I've been hearing that bug hives are any place with more than 20,000 people. No matter how red it is or how much of it is in a red state, it's enemy territory, and you begin to wonder about some of these takes and ideas. So I'm going to have to address both of these ideas. I think before I get to begin on this, I do want to say is like we're not hating on the working class. We're not necessarily hating. We're not hating on rural America. We're not saying that like all these people are dumb slaves who are idiots and we're just like we're better than them. What we're simply saying is that there is this fantasy of them and idolization that is divorced from reality and what life is like. At the end of the day, we're not about a class struggle. We're all in this together, no matter if you're, a plumber living out in the middle of nowhere versus, a woke, based like tax accountant living in Chicago. There are many degrees of people who are in this, and we're not defined by class. And that's an important part I want to say. But I do want, with that in mind, is that I don't like this idea that we're somehow the new Marxists. We're fighting for the real proletariat, and we're primarily a working class movement. We are not primarily a working class movement. We have a significant working class element, but we are primarily a middle class movement. And this isn't just, I'm speaking here of the dissident right in general. And even on the right, like the Trump base, it is still primarily middle class. I always bring up this example from when they were talking about January 6th. And I know this might not be the best snapshot of like the Trump base, but this is like the hardcore Trump supporters. And the majority of that base, of the people who were arrested in January 6th, were primarily middle class. I think it was a slight plurality was college educated. Most of these guys did not work in traditional blue collar trades. That was like a small minority of it. You could say that some of these guys are still working class, even though they're not necessarily in the blue collar field. Majority of them were middle class. And I'll give the specific numbers about this because I have them pulled up right now. So the 28% worked white collar jobs, while 26% were business owners. Only 22% worked blue collar jobs and 7% were unemployed. So, going off the 28 and 26%, that's a majority. And then only, a slight majority had a college education, while 47% only had a high school education. Now, some of the people with a college education, it was like didn't graduate, but they did have a college education. And generally, when we consider middle class, it's some college, but regardless of the degree, that is changing a little bit. But that's the standard we have for that. And so, if you're looking at the like hardest core people, the people willing to do, now maybe you could say that that's like not the base, but the people who are at the rally, I mean, those are the most hardcore supporters. And even if you go to a Trump rally, it's probably the same demographics that are there and who are voting for him. And even if you looked at voting polls, a lot of the people who were voting for Trump, they may have not had a college degree, but they generally had something that could be considered a middle class income. Now, non-college educated whites were, of course, a major part of the Trump phenomenon, and he was winning them over to a much greater extent than past Republicans. And without that support, he wouldn't have won in 2016. That is true, but that's not the whole story, and that's not our whole base. We still have a lot of middle class people. We still have, even though the suburbs are going, a little bit bluer, you still need to win over white suburbanites and these white middle class people in order to win elections. And that's what was learned in Virginia. Youngkin got these non-college educated whites out in rural areas. He got a very high turnout among them and a great amount of support from them. But he also was able to win because he brought back a lot of the white suburbanites back into the Republican fold. So this is just something to think about. But when it comes to the dissident right, like I would say our numbers are even greater on leaning towards middle class, non-rural. And somebody had even a scientific, it's maybe not a scientific poll about this, but one of my many critics had a poll showing, asking, where do people live? Now, of course, this is not scientific, but this guy is one of those dudes who's advocating for rural revolution, who's demanding that all urbanites be killed. And he even had this, these guys love 20 tweet threads about their plans. And he was basically promising that the entire any area with more than 20,000 people was going to be razed to the ground. So you would think that this guy, most of his followers would be at least out of cities or, far away from the bugmen and the bug hives that this guy describes. But this guy's poll showed the opposite. Only 10% of people said that they live in a rural area, and about roughly 20% said a small town, which I'd have to wonder what they consider a small town. Like, it could be a place that these guys considered a bug hive city, because they do think that Coeur d'Alene is Idaho, which is a nice, a very Republican area, but it is drawing in a lot of Californians and other people that they view with skepticism and hate. I'll talk about more about the Californian question in a moment. They may consider that a small town, any place with 50,000 people. And so that's around 20%. And some of these people may consider that a large city. And then over 40% say suburbs. And then nearly 30, and then another like 27, 28% say cities. And so, that's over 2/3 of right-wing Twitter that lives in an area that another half of right-wing Twitter would say is a bug hive. And I think it's even lesser. I think it's even lower numbers in real life among the whole Twitter. I mean, this is primarily the guys on Rural Revolution who's talking about how great rural life is and imagining as an idyllic existence, which I've been saying that a lot of these people who are saying this about rural life don't live there. And sure enough, the poll proves my point. And I mean, that's not, as I said, not a scientific survey, but I think it's a good estimation. And this is people self-reporting. And a lot of people would probably want to say they're rural, a small town, to give them an edge. And, when you only have 10% of people who can count as part of rural America, on dissident right Twitter and are, anti-urbanite, and they only 10% of them living there, I don't think you're going to have an American Khmer Rouge. Now, to give some backstory on this, because I brought up Coeur d'Alene earlier, is that this started because, some of my friends and I have been seeing these like takes on there where it's like pretending that, and I'm even told by some commentators that rural America is completely free of the pause. Like, these areas are entirely controlled by us. We can withstand any revolutions or social unrest that's coming here. And they like to talk about how these small towns resisted BLM invasions, which I don't know what examples they have, but one of the main examples they have is Coeur d'Alene, which is a very white town. There's not many blacks there at all. And there was a militia that showed up, and they had, the rifles and such. And I don't think there was a plan. There may have been a small planned BLM protest, probably by some of the like white shitlibs that live there. Not a riot, and these guys showed up, and there really wasn't any violence, which this is a show of force. And there were examples of like small communities of a lot of the suburb areas that may have been outside of some of the riot zones, and they were worried about guys coming to their neighborhoods. And you saw people armed up in pickup trucks and ready for that. And there were some other examples of resistance where people actually attacked these protesters. In Philadelphia, the white ethnics who were there. This, as all you guys know, Philadelphia is not rural America at all. These are white ethnics living in their neighborhood. And like in Fishtown, these guys were beating up BLM rioters who were coming into their neighborhood and community. And there was a second example that was a few weeks or even maybe a few months later where they were trying to attack a Christopher Columbus statue, and all these Italians were out there being like, hell no, you're not. And he like intimidated an Antifa reporter and slashed his bicycle tires and told him to get the hell out. So and these guys were definitely, if BLM protesters tried to show up, there definitely would have been blows exchanged. And none of these guys were like armed with weapons. They were just armed with, their fists and maybe some baseball bats. So there were examples of resistance. And I don't want to be totally blackpilled where saying it's like there was no resistance there. But in a lot of areas where you saw that if there were any resistance, like Kyle Rittenhouse, like the Texas Army sergeant who, there was these, checkpoint in Austin, and some like Boogaloo boy, anti-racist Boogaloo boy began threatening this guy with his rifle, and the army sergeant like took him out, like he was like threatening his car, and it's totally self-defense. He's now charged with murder. Rittenhouse, you guys all know the Rittenhouse story. And even guys who are like trying to, they were blocked by, people attacking their car, and then they tried to get around them and they were arrested. And there's there's even an example where a guy who shot like somebody trying to break through one of these left-wing gun checkpoints, and he got a minor charge. I'm trying to remember which city it was. I'm wanting to say it's like Olympia, or is one of the West Coast areas that happened in. And of course, there's the Chaz situation in Seattle where these guys executed some black kids who, acted suspiciously around their checkpoint, and nobody has been arrested for that. And so this is like kind of outrageous stuff that we saw, that this happened in a lot of parts of areas, but a lot of these guys say it's like, we want them to try and do this stuff in our area. Let's see how well it'll turn out in our areas. Our areas are so based and stuff. And what a main point we like to say is that the pause and the negativity of modern America affects all elements of American society. Some places it affects more. You could say Portland, Oregon. That's a lot worse than, say, a nice rural town in Montana. I will agree with that, but that still doesn't. You still should not ignore the point that there are still problems in that nice rural town, and it's still infected by the American decline. And just for that simple point, and as you can see it in this Coeur d'Alene situation, which started this whole thing, is that they were at a city council and parents were complaining about this degenerate art that the city council was putting up, and had satanic themes. And the city council was like, "What's wrong with this? We're not going to care about this." And it's like, and I simply joked, it's like base Coeur d'Alene showing how, middle America is totally free of the pause, and people just got mad about it. And they're like, this isn't rural America. Okay, I'll give you, it's not necessarily rural America, but it's very red. Coeur d'Alene is not a bug hive. And people are like saying, well, it's a suburb of Spokane. Spokane is a city of only 200,000 people. And Spokane itself is not like one of the most liberal cities in America. It is not Seattle or Portland. Eastern Washington is, pretty conservative. It's surrounded by conservative area. And being I would say more of an exurb, you could say it's a suburb, but being a suburb or an exurb of a city that's like 200,000 or 100,000 people is completely different from being a suburb of like Chicago, DC, Atlanta. It's a very different type of thing, because people are not, college educated whites are not just like going to Spokane like in droves, or the libtards are not going there like they're, say, going to Atlanta, San Francisco, Seattle, New York City, Chicago, those type of places. It's not one of those types of cities. It'd be like saying, like one of these, I would put out the example of Chattanooga, Tennessee, which has about roughly the same population as Spokane. It'd be like saying like Ottawa, which is one of these suburbs outside of Chattanooga, is actually a liberal bug hive because it's a suburb or an exurb of a city. And it's like, no, Ottawa's very conservative, very red, and there's like very country areas surrounding it too. And that's another difference, is that a lot of these cities, their suburbs and exurbs have a lot of more country mixed into their areas than others. But I will agree, Coeur d'Alene is a lot of Californians are moving there. There are more libs moving there because it's a nice area. It's nice, homogenous, low crime, nice little town square. It's a nice place to live, and it's very conservative. But people want to say you can't live there. It's too nice, which is whatever. So that spiraled this discussion about this, and guys were like saying that's like too big, and really where it's coming from in rural America is like towns with 1,000 people. So now that's going to get to the first point that I've been talking about in this, and the 2 points talking about the plumber option. As a reminder, the first point is talking about how rural America is going to serve as this revolutionary breeding ground or it's going to lead to the national divorce, and we can just kick out the cities and just rely on rural America, and the real revolutionary class are rural Americans. This, it's not, I don't want to say that we need rural Americans on our side, because we clearly do. And if you look at elections, Republicans absolutely need rural Americans on their side. But when it comes to massive changes, rural Americans are not going to be capable of it on its own. First off, only 19% of Americans live in rural areas. Second off, rural areas are overwhelmingly much older than, or not overwhelmingly, but are much older than the rest of America. It's the same number. 19% of rural areas are 19% of the people in rural America are 65 years or older. And 85% of the counties where it's, at least 20% of the population is over 65 or 65 or older are rural. So when I said this, I made these tweets saying that one of the key developments or elements needed in a social revolution is a youth surplus. If you look back in time at any point in history where there's a social unrest or turbulence or some type of social change, it's driven by an oversupply of young people. French Revolution, Russian Revolution, the Arab Spring, if you want to look at that, even with some of the things that America was going through in the 60s with that unrest, a lot of it was we had a lot of young people. We don't necessarily, America doesn't have that problem today. I mean, we definitely don't have a surplus of youth. We have, and in rural areas, it's especially true that there's no surplus of youth. So really, when you're talking about like these radical types who are going to take on revolution, I don't want to say it's not just generally people who are 65 years or older. You're relying on boomers and Gen Xers, people who are at least 40 or older, to carry on a revolution and to carry on social change and want this desperate change. And there's no class of people who are less willing to change the way things are. I mean, especially with people who are 65 years or older, they depend on the government. They depend on the system operating in order to survive. They are on fixed incomes. They're on their pensions. They're on Social Security. They have their medical care that is handled by the government. They're on Medicare. They are not willing to just overthrow the system for some bold alternative that cannot guarantee these things that they need to survive. And even it's the same with these Gen Xer types. When they're going and talking about having a civil war revolution, you have to think is like when you're in your 40s and 50s, you've got a lot of weird injuries and problems that you didn't have in your 20s. You might have you might have acid reflux. You might have bad knees, bad back. You might have just like some other problems that you just didn't have before. You're not willing to. There's a reason why militaries want young men who are like 18 to 25 as their primary soldiers, not guys from 40 to 60. And I think is that you're relying a lot on, in a lot of these militias, I've talked to these people who are like in like these militia groups or in like they're the guys who are always talking about the Civil War Revolution. They're like any guy, the average age of these guys is 45 and older. There's very little of the guys that militaries want are the age group that militaries want in fighting their wars, and 18 to 24 or 18, maybe you could extend it to 18 to 30. That's the minority. The majority is Gen Xers who are in their 40s and 50s. And that presents a problem if you're expecting, you to go to war against the most powerful nation in the world and you're relying on pensioners and middle-aged men with severe back problems. It's not necessarily a combination you're having. And also, a lot of these middle-aged guys, they've got real responsibilities. They've got kids. They've got a wife. They've got, mortgage payments to pay off. Like, they have, things tying them down. And a lot of their rural revolution theories or fantasies are just that. They're fantasies for them. They're dreaming, they're at their shitty job or they're at their shitty work. And they're just like, wouldn't this a lot be better if I was like a soldier fighting in the trenches? And people like to dream about that. This is a common male fantasy to have. It's just like, wouldn't it be better if we were just overthrowing this corrupt system and I was there? And then when reality hits them, is like, I've got a mortgage payment to pay. I'm gonna take care of. I've got to assure my kids are taken care of. I gotta please my wife. These are the things that the responsibilities that face them. And so some of them might be divorced, so they might be taking out their revenge fantasies that they are talking about in urbanites that are really thinking about their ex-wife taking their kids away. And so a lot of guys are like that. So this is not necessarily a revolutionary class that you're talking about here. This is a much older demographic that is held down. And also one argument that I have to point out is that they're always talking about like how we're going to have a revolution and stuff if we all become plumbers. But then they like the arguments that they're saying that you guys need to take on these trades is that they pay way better and have way more benefits than other jobs. It's like, how are you creating a revolutionary class by these guys all being extremely well paid and having great benefits and somehow they're going to overthrow the government? It's like I don't necessarily see the connection there, and that's what they always try to claim about the plumber option, is that everyone's just making a boatload of money and having epic benefits and stuff. But at the same time, these guys are also going to have a revolution. It's like I think there's a disconnect there, a big disconnect. Some of the people advocating for this stuff think that also rural America is going to be converted to a type of I don't know if national Bolshevism is the way to say this, but there's a type of mix of populist, collectivist style economics along with social conservatism, and this is what's going to win over them. And they're forgetting that like rural America is like one of the most fervently libertarian places. Not like libertarian like Cato, but like this folk libertarianism I have. And in, some of it has the negative aspects of folk libertarianism. Is a lot of these people only care about issues that occur on their property or things that might affect their personal property. It's like their vision of the world does not extend far past their own front yard. And anything else that may intrude is like, screw them. I've got my own piece of territory. This is what I'm going to defend. The rest of the world can screw off. It is not necessarily this like collective identity that you would have seen in the proletariat in the 19th and 20th century, where they're organized into unions and there was a real sense of class solidarity and class identity. These guys have a class identity of like rural America, but they're not going to like organize on that basis. They're not like organizing as like the anti-urbanite league. They just simply, they make jokes, they have opinions about this, but they're not going to go much further past issues that they can't see outside their own door. That's like their own concern, is like my own property, my own issues. I'm narrowly concerned on that. And this is not just a rural American phenomenon. As you can see this among middle-class whites too, is that it's like my domain is my main concern. I see there's terrible things in the world out there, but you know what? I don't really care about that. What I really care about is my own narrow concerns. And this is something across America, but this is also very prevalent among rural Americans. And when they're wanting to see this as like this revolutionary class that's advocating for populist economics and a collectivist spirit, I cannot imagine a population with less of that collectivist spirit than a lot of rural Americans. That's both a good and bad thing. It's like, as you guys know, if you've listened to my podcast, I've spoken highly of the folk libertarianism and what we need to appeal to. But the type of revolutionary class dynamic that these people imagine, that they're transposing images of the 19th century European proletariat among rural Americans, is just far-fetched, and they're thinking of a completely different people than what actually exists. They do not want to pay more taxes. They want to pay as little amount of taxes as possible. I mean, this is one of the main issues driving them. This is why anybody promises tax cuts or tax relief or lowering taxes, they love that. They hate paying taxes. They do not want to. They do not have this collectivist spirit. And in a lot of ways, that's a positive thing, because you got to see about how state and federal governments misspend money. It's an understandable trait they have, but this type of them getting won over to like conservative socialism is a massive fantasy, and using Marxist analysis to see them like the chuds as the new proletariat is, you're living in a different country, and it's a complete fantasy. Now, going on to the problems of rural America. I've talked about this before, but rural America is not an idyllic location. There are some very nice things about rural America. There are a lot of great rural towns, but even a lot of the great rural towns are small towns that you think of that are really nice, that are kind of bedroom communities that some of these guys are attacking. There are very liberal people there. One of the good things I would say is that rural America, yes, a lot of these people are very conservative. A lot of these people are not down with LGBT stuff. They hate Black Lives Matter. If they saw a guy protesting for Black Lives Matter, they would get really mad. There was an example of this in like some place in rural Arkansas. There was a guy who had did a one-man Black Lives Matter protest in front of a Walmart, and all these guys were like, "Fuck you, get out of here, live!" And they're throwing their drinks at this guy. They hated this guy, and they would all approach him like, "What the hell is this about?" And they all confronted this guy. They did not like it at all. And so that's one of the good aspects of this. These are conservative, solid people that generally aspire to this. But there's also negative aspects. It's like a lot of these people are not living the traditional family life that people envision. I mean, a lot of these people are getting divorces. A lot of these people have like children, raising children on their own, single. There's a ton of drug abuse, I think, as you guys all understood. There's a lot of, missed job opportunities. There's a lot of dilapidation to their cities. A lot of deaths of despair of like older men who are maybe underemployed or not employed at all, just simply dying off either due to suicide or, bad health choices taken on due to depression at their state. So there's a lot of issues. It's not just like you're going there and this is like this immaculate small town and there's bodybuilder guys like there with jacked and they're blonde hair, blue eyed, and they look like Dolph Lundgren, and they're just like there with their family where they've got Dolph Lundgren Jr.'s following them around, and then they're like, oh, time to do push-ups, and then like the whole army of Dolph Lundgren ruralites show up and do joint push-up, 100 push-ups together in the street. And then and if it's Sunday, they all go to their traditionalist Latin mass. And that is not rural life at all. There's like a lot of problems. There's a lot of, even though obesity strikes everywhere, you're going to see that a lot in rural America. I think there are other places where are more obese, particularly some places with a lot of magic, but yeah, it's not this reputation. And even compared to the suburbs, I think if you I don't want to necessarily hate on rural Americans, and I think a lot of so I'm not going to go with that route, and a lot of the bad things we see with rural America are not their fault. They lost their jobs. There's not a lot of economic growth there. The only food that they can have available is at Walmart, and maybe it's the unhealthiest choices. So a lot of this obesity and the opioid epidemic, it's not just because they're bad people. It is due to social trends that have led them to be much more degenerated. And that's one thing that we want to solve. We want to make them better. We want to end these things that are making them dependent on terrible food and drugs, and that are leading to social circumstances that are not the best, that are very dysfunctional social circumstances, you would say. We want to improve that and make a society where they live healthy. But, just looking to like traditional small towns and imagining as mom and pop stores, and, everyone's there good, healthy and everything, and there's no divorce and stuff. It's like, you guys might need to read Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance to understand that there are issues with that. That shouldn't lead us to hate them or to like see them as bad people because of it is there. But, this idyllic notion of just these people who are making tons of money, they're all jacked and they're all ready to overthrow, the system. It's just not necessarily true. And there's a massive brain drain from the rural areas. Like I've talked about this before. It's like a lot of kids who are there who are like the really smart kids in their class. They want to get out of there. Maybe that's not the best thing, but they do. They are like there and they're like, if I want to be ambitious, if I want to do more than what's offered in this town, I've got to get out of here. I've got to go to college. I've got to move to the city and whatever. And that's like, there's a massive brain drain there. Some of the people on Twitter probably think this is awesome because you don't need any people with white collar knowledge base. You don't need any accountants or lawyers or or engineers. You just need tradesmen. Maybe that's their opinion, and they don't need that in rural America. They can build a whole society based around tradesmen, which you can. And you also cannot build a society without tradesmen. You need multiple elements there, but that's what's happening with a lot of the brain drain too. And it's not just all liberals. It's not just like guys who are, the hick libs of their town and they just hate everybody. A lot of them are very conservative. Like I knew a lot of these guys in college who were in my fraternity. They were 100% conservative, understood these things. They love the rural hobbies of hunting and fishing, but they're like, man, back home, there is nothing there for me. I've got to move somewhere else. And so it's not all hicklibs. I would even say that it's like a minority of hicklibs who are doing that. I feel like a lot of the hicklibs like to stay home just so they can complain about their community, but that's a different topic. Now, some people might say, look, you don't need a majority of people to take down the system or to lead to a revolution or civil war. They'll always bring up the American Revolution where not like it wasn't even a majority of the people who were on the side of the patriots. I mean, the plurality of people were just ambivalent or, you know, neutral during the Civil War. Or, I mean, not, well, it was our first Civil War, American Revolution. You know, it was only like a quarter or a third who were actively patriots in that struggle. And like, you know, 45% were just neutral. And they'll point that out. They'll be like, well, with 19% of the population, we could just take on the rest of the country and we can just have an American Khmer Rouge fighting against the urbanites. Well, you know, looking at the country with the real Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, in the early 1970s, 95% of the population was rural. 95%. So it made sense why they're, you know, these guys, these demagogues, these social communist demagogues were going on about anti-urban. It's like they're appealing to 95% of the population and saw that these urban people were looking down on them, were disconnected from them, and they wanted to take their revenge on them and kill them. And also, I don't think Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, is like a noble thing to look at. It's like them just like killing anyone with an education or living in a certain area. I don't necessarily look upon that positively. I don't know why. And everyone's like, this is like a horrible thing what they do to like how evil Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge were. But now in America, they're like, base, let's do this. And it's like, you know, there are a problem with people in the cities. I understand these like yuppies and others who are shit libs who are in the cities, but not everyone is like that. And it's the suburbs are also not like that. And people want to extend it to the suburbs, but you know, it's 19% of the population that's somehow going to rule over 81%. And you can look even other times where even when ruralites were the majority of the population, they still didn't even get to determine the revolution. When the Russian Revolution broke out in 1917, rural people were 85% of the population. But the Bolsheviks were notorious for not being led by the peasants and by oppressing the peasants during the Russian Civil War. And a lot of these peasants were trying to form their own little type of militias, I guess you could call it, their armies that were just focused on, you know, protecting their own land and keeping everyone else out, like the whites and the reds. They just wanted their own areas. And the Reds really crushed these forces, and really they got outmaneuvered by the urban proletariat, which was much smaller. That was the real base of Bolshevik support, and also a lot of these soldiers and sailors that were relying on, and and I guess a lot of these ethnic minorities that were there, like the Latvians and some of the Lithuanians and some of even the Poles who just like decided to join the communists. And George and all these other groups that were there joining, particularly the Latvian Rifles, which was a major part of the revolution. And so it wasn't even rural directed, even though there were 85% of the population. It was rural cause. A lot of these people were just like, no, we're not. We're hoarding our food. We're tired of this government like taking all our food. And that was some of the reasons that there was so much chaos and instability. But in terms of directing it and leading it, yeah, the peasantry was not leading this effort in the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War. It was outside forces, and that was 85% of the population. And a lot of those people were very young, who were in the fighting age, which current rural America, which is only 19% of the population, has a shortage of. So that's something to consider when people are talking about this rural revolution fantasy. And this is not meant to blackpill people. As a lot of people are accusing me of being a blackpill by telling them they're not going to have this revolution or national wars coming from rural America. It's not a blackpill when you're just acknowledging reality. As I pointed out, like, you know, if you told somebody that they can't fly or grow 8 feet tall, there may be people who are 8 feet tall. So I'm going to say 10 feet tall. There's people that are sort of close to 8 feet tall. I'm sure if the tallest person may be close to that. So I'm going to say 10 feet tall. If you tell people that it's not a black pill, it's like, oh man, I wish I could be 10 feet tall. It's like, you know what? You can't be 10 feet tall. And it's the same with this. It's like, you know, this rural revolution is just not going to happen. We still need to win these people over. We still need to appeal to these people. I don't want to hate on them. We're not necessarily, this is not coming from a point of hate or derision or contempt. This is just simply coming from like, this is reality. And we are building up this fantasy that doesn't exist in the real world. And it's going to lead us to doing stupid things and pursuing stupid strategies of trying to pretend that we're going to start some guerrilla army out in rural America, or even worse, like adopting this Khmer Rouge mentality where you're just anti anyone who lives in a place where other people live. And no, that's like stupid. It's the same way that you shouldn't hate on rural Americans. And I don't think nobody's like hating on rural, working class or rural Americans. They're just pointing out that there's like a lot of problems there. There's a lot of problems elsewhere in America. But even I would say, like, a lot of people hate on the suburbs. I would say, like, this maybe not. I don't think the suburbs are the ideal way of living. There are problems with the suburbs, but I usually defend if you're a white middle class person and you're choosing a place to live, I still recommend the suburbs are pretty nice places to live. In terms of the type of human capital that are there, you're not going to have to deal with in certain small towns where it's like a lot of the young people are on opioids or on drug abuse. There are substance abuse in the suburbs, but it's not as prevalent and it's not as noticeable to people. And it's not like where you go to the town square and you can see somebody passed out in front of an abandoned shop. It's generally not going to happen in suburbia. I mean, there are problems in suburbia. You have to drive everywhere. There's kind of an anonymity to it. But a lot of the people you're going to see are still like healthy white people, with a lot of good looking kids and stuff. You're not going to see the type of, and you can still see that in rural America. I'm not saying that there's people don't exist. I know those people exist. I'm friends with them, but you also see a lot of things that are quite grim as well. But if you enjoy rural America, if that's your hometown, if you're able to do your activities that you want to do there, more power to you. If these are simply just my recommendations of what people to live. But every person is different, and every person was want to live in a place where they feel that they're at home and that's their community. And that could be either in a rural place where there's like 500 people, or it could be in a suburb, or it can even be in a major city. Even though I do think that there are problems with like living in certain major cities like New York City, DC proper. A lot of people think I live in DC. I don't live in DC. I can't reveal my location, but I have never actually lived in DC, the city. And there's I would even question Atlanta. But some people live in these places just because it's work there. It's where their life is. Maybe they might need to move, but that's it. But I'm merely pushing back because there's so many people who are like, drop wherever you live, move out into rural America and get a homestead, and this is our path to power. And it's like, no, the rural revolution is not coming from, or is not happening. And like the Civil War and national divorce talk, even if you want a national divorce, you're going to have some power in the cities, because that's what makes policy. And even that's the case, and people are complaining about Idaho and like how it's becoming liberal. Like Coeur d'Alene and Boise, Coeur d'Alene's pretty conservative, have a lot more influence, like they themselves, than any type of rural town. Now, all of rural Idaho taken together, of course, has more power than Boise. But Boise compared to like one or two towns, you can see which is, the cities still dominate these places. And in order to have influence over state policy, you're going to have some presence in the cities. I don't necessarily say you're going to take over like Chicago or Denver or something, but I do think it's like, you just can't entirely give up the cities and colleges and give it over to our enemies, because that is essentially ceding the ground. And one of my main critiques about the Plumber Option is that it really is proletarianizing whites in turning us into a demi-class where we serve our enemies in these jobs where we're ultimately taking orders from them. And instead of building power and independence, we're just simply accepting our role as the proletarian. Rather than being a revolutionary proletariat, we're just kind of a neutered proletariat. That's my opinion about that. I'll get to that a little bit in a moment. But simply, this is not a black pill. It's just like we have to accept reality, and we have to realize that there's going to be different strategies at play. And I think giving up on cities, suburbs, white collar jobs, and colleges is a retreat rather than a path to power. And it's like a severe retreat that would just lead to us being the proletariat class that is ordered around by Indian liberals. There's not, but like people in the past, it's, they have not looked upon the people doing their servile menial jobs as like the real lords in society. Germans do not make fun of Poles as plumbers because they see them as the lords of their society. And it's the same way here. It's like, we are not going to overthrow the system or change the system by unclogging the toilets, libtard toilets. I just have to say that, and people need to remember this. And I know I always use Plumber as the example, but it's like, they call us up, and they still have the power, and they direct the resources in society, and they are the ones who are making decisions, and we have no influence over that. All the influence we have is to fix their, air conditioning or fix their toilet and build their houses, and we're just kind of like their servants. And to a lot of people, to a lot of the Asian liberals, they would love this, that we become their Dalit class. We're the new untouchables. They assign us to these like rural ghettos where we're just there, and like, oh, these stupid dumb white people, and they're like, but I need somebody to come fix my toilet, and they call us up, and then they're like, bye, and then they continue to rule our society and make decisions about what happened in our communities. And if we want to speak up, if we want to challenge that, well, we've self-isolated ourselves from the positions of power and influence. Like, none of us are lawyers, none of us are accountants, none of us are financiers, none of us are in city government or state government, or maybe we might control our little local government, maybe we might have control of the sheriff. But we don't have any influence over the federal government. We're just an isolated class that is restricted, and all we can do are service and trades jobs, and that's it. We're the Dalit class for the new liberal overlords, and I think that's what a lot of this leads to. But just to repeat on the first option, it's not a black pill to see reality. It's just acknowledging reality. And, we can't build a revolution on 19% of the population, particularly when many of them are aging and are not, don't really have the resources or abilities to, challenge the system at the moment. The real goal is to push for a counter elite. We need people at all levels. I'm not saying like, if you're somebody who, I'm going to go into the second point, because this is now beginning to address the second point, which is like saying everyone needs to drop out of college, go to trade school, do not get a white collar job, move to a rural area. This is what you need to do with your life. And, for some people that is their goal. I think if you're a kid in high school who hates dealing with the books, hates dealing with that shit, they may be a really smart person who understands a lot of history and they like history, but they just don't like school. They prefer to work with their hands. Their family is all done blue collar labor. Then more power to you, and you can make a good living, a solid income doing a trade job. I don't think it's recession proof, which I'll get to in a moment, which some people are saying, but very few jobs are recession proof. So that's just something to come in mind. But I think people like that are a minority, or at least among the young kids who are actually wondering about what they want to do in life. That is a small minority among the people. As you can see with the polling that are people taking places like, where do you live? And, only 30% say small town or rural. And I think about the 70% of these guys have more middle class or white collar aptitudes versus, it's they prefer what type of labor they prefer, and the type of culture and social milieu that they've grown up with, it leans more middle class and white collar. And this is just not the best fit for a lot of guys, and I don't think it's a one size fit all, or it's a golden ticket for everyone. For a lot of people it is. I think we do need to encourage more people to think seriously about going to college and whether college is right for them. And that's more of a social issue that we need to address. If we had power, we would be encouraging more trade schools, especially in areas where maybe a lot of these kids are, schooling isn't their thing, and they would need to go in trade schools. But the people we're talking to, I don't think are a part of that demographic, because a lot of our guys, if they're in high school or in college and they're thinking about their life, they're probably much smarter than the rest of their demographic. They're also probably much more geared towards middle class aptitudes and stuff. I mean, they're spending a lot of time online. They're reading a lot of history. A lot of kids don't read. These guys are reading. They're taking in a lot of information about history, about politics. Having an interest in politics and history in high school or even college makes you well above the rest of your peers. And I think, telling these guys you're really smart, it seems like you could really advance yourself in middle class white collar work. Don't do that. You know what? I know you have no experience with blue collar life and you come from a middle class background. Drop out of college and go and get your plumbing license. And I don't think that's the right advice for those people. Now there are some young guys who maybe lead more rural working class that may be listening to this stuff. But the people we're talking to is like a very narrow demographic. A lot of these guys lean on the more the nerdy side, really into video games, really into anime. Even though I've been told that a lot of working class people are now into anime, I can't verify that. But these are not the stereotypical guys that you think of going into blue collar fields. And a lot of like the blue collar fields are being taken over by immigrants, but so is a lot of white collar labor, like computer programmers and engineers being taken over by H-1B visas. So that's the main point of the thing. I think if like no matter what you're doing, you should try to figure out what you're going to do with life and whatever you're studying, whether you're in college or in trade school, and plot out a course for that. Some people don't, what they go to college for, they don't plan to go for. I was planning to go to law school after college, but somehow through mistakes, I became a podcaster and a writer, which was not in my preparation. I don't recommend people to do this. A lot of people like attack me as like, you recommend everyone work at a think tank or be a podcaster and stuff. It's like, no, I do not. I do not recommend this life for most people. There's a lot of issues that come with it, but that's a separate podcast. Even when it comes to like the think taker. But I think if we're like looking at ways for people to have solid, steady jobs that like they can't get fired from or are going to be recession proof, telling people to work for like government jobs is like probably like really where it should be at. Be like government bureaucrats. Like you can't get fired for unless it's like really bad. You get a ton of great benefits, a lot of travel, or a lot of vacation time, and you could possibly have some influence over the way the world operates by being a city bureaucrat. And people just don't want to do that. They're like, no. Drop out of college and go do a trade. And it's like, well, that might be good, but for a lot of these guys, if they just want a solid, steady job with good benefits that may give them some influence, why not a city government job? Or better yet, why not law enforcement? When I suggested that a great blue-collar profession that people should go into is law enforcement, a lot of these guys have been yelling at me all weekend about how I hate the working class and I'm a soft hands, urbanite bugman, got very mad about the law enforcement take about the police officers because, of course, all these people are anti-cop, even though they're a blue-collar profession, too, that's very noble. And we need to respect, but can't go into law enforcement. Gotta do a trade instead. And just like the rural ideal that people like to espouse, like there are issues with like these trades, even though they do usually provide a stable income. I think people don't realize some of the problems. First off, as a lot of people even who work in these trades can tell you, you do have the problem of injuries. And unlike in white collar work where you can just like slug it off and work from your computer, injury means you can't work. And I guess you get workers' comp, but some of these injuries may be permanent, that may make you have to choose another career. And you can see this in a lot of guys who are in their 40s and 50s. They got some injury to their back or their knee or, some muscle tear or something that like pretty much ensures they can't really do the job anymore. And they have to retrain and do something else. And some people talked about the salary caps. Like that's like a different is like some places it may be due to union regulations or whatever, maybe capped at 80K, which is pretty good money in a lot of places. But you may be able to get more if you set up your own business. There's a lot of things like there. I'm not gonna go off the income, but it's just a lot of problems that it's just not as easy as people think. And there's just like something, and especially when it comes to like construction, like there are so many potential ways to get injured in construction. And it's not just like being a pansy or anything. It's like, yeah, if you like, break something, that could end your career. You'd have to you'd have to change your whole career path. Or even like some of these injuries may end up in death, rarely, but these things can happen. I don't think you can get like killed at a white collar profession or some injury happens that you have to completely change your career. That's just not the case in a lot of these things. And even the guys I talk to, I've like gotten like so many people reached out to me that are like actually work in these fields. Like, thank you, Scott, for telling people this. Like, we've been trying to argue like these guys are not operating in the real world. Like, you are telling it like it is. Thank you. And like the same with like rural America. It's like guys who actually live in rural America and have operated with it. It's like, man, it's really not the Mayberry anymore. It's not Mayberry anymore. There are a ton of problems with it, and I think people are just selling a fantasy. And it's the same with like blue collar work. No, if it's like if that's what you want to do, I mean, it's the same with like white collar work. I mean, like it's hard to sell people on like having a make believe job or whatever might be a make believe job, and you're an office job. That is what it is. But one thing that has to be described is like status, and this is something that people get really upset about when you bring up the status question. While plumbers and others do make good money, and a lot of times they make more money than office drones, it is still seen as low status. Now that may not be a problem with a lot of people. Your whole social and family milieu is considered low status. You don't give a shit. That's just the way you are, and you're not going to change the way you are to match social opinion. And a lot of people just think whites in general are low status. I understand that, so I'm not going to say that is. But this becomes a problem when you're trying to build a family and try to find a partner. If you're on, going around and you're, no matter who you are, and you're just like, oh, what do you do? I'm a plumber. A lot of women who are, high IQ, probably the type of woman that you would want to have kids with, is going to be like, no, I'm not dating a plumber. And that's just the way life is. I'm sorry that's the way women are. Now, maybe you're so charismatic or whatever, or so Chad that maybe you can win her over and it doesn't matter that you're a plumber or a welder or whatever you are. Sure, maybe that can happen. But generally these women would, as long as you can have like a make-believe office job and say that that's what you are, they'll be like, oh, okay, sure, that's fine. That's not going to be a red flag. I'd much rather date that. That's like the social situation it is that people are going to look down on you. You're going to be considered low status. This is where the low class is. That's why I talk, it's not necessarily right that that's the way it is. That's just the way life is, that they look down upon it. People always say I look down upon it, and like I'm kind of sitting. I was like, no, I'm just saying that this is what other people think. This is what the majority of middle class society thinks. Maybe they could change their opinions. Okay, but trying to tell women to change their ideas and whatever that they should do, that's going to be that's a difficult challenge, as we all know, with white women being programmed with so much propaganda. You can tell them to stop being snooty and whatever. Maybe they'll change their mind, but I doubt that's going to happen. Now you may say, it's like, that's not the type of women you'd want to date anyway. You'd want to date the women that date welders and plumbers and stuff. Maybe that's your type of woman, but my experience, the type of women with this are got bad family home problems. Because, I mean, like, this is something to say about the white working class, is that downscale whites, is that they have a lot of family issues. Like, and this is not their fault. This is not saying that they're naturally bad. But this is a lot of times why they're kept in a cycle of poverty, is due to some of the family issues that they grew up with. They've got a lot of abuse in them, or maybe they had parents missing, or there's like a substance abuse, and just like ways that are just like there. You got the problems with that. A lot of these women, pretty much most working class white women now distinguish themselves with a lot of tattoos, a lot of noticeable tattoos. Even though middle class white women now have tattoos, it's much more prevalent among working class white women. It's the same way with working class white men. They now have a lot of tattoos, but I think you can tell that one thing that distinguishes right-wing Twitter and ensures that this is a middle class movement is how many people post about how much they dislike tattoos. While if this is a working class movement, people would be talking about how awesome their tattoos are and showing them off on the internet. People don't do that. And whenever even guys post physique, it's generally they have no tattoos, which is a good sign, is like a clear sign that most of our guys are middle class. That is a distinguishing mark between middle class men and working class men, I think, is the tattoo question. With women, it's a little bit different. I mean, a lot of white middle and upper class women love to get tattoos. They usually get on the rib cages, or maybe on their arm somewhere, like their underarm, or maybe on their ankle. They get in weird, odd places. It's not that noticeable. But working class women, it's like full sleeve, very noticeable tattoos, even sometimes like neck tattoos and stuff. And they love tattoos. And they also love pit bulls too. I was telling somebody, I had a friend who was telling me this story about a life in their town in Alabama, or just like people that she works with and stuff. And she said that there was like somebody, a woman she worked with, and she's going through a messy divorce. And one of the parts of the messy divorce is that she had to sneak into her ex's home and rescue her pit bulls. And this woman has seen him send a picture of her, and she had noticeable tattoos on her collarbone and stuff. And it's like, wow. And a lot of these women are also gonna get plumper as well. As like it's like exercising and working out is more of a middle class. For women, I think it's more of a middle class thing. I mean, men, of course, obviously they're blue collar. They gotta, depending on their trade, they've got to maintain some degree of shape. I mean, they're working with their bodies all day. Hopefully, they can't just be a tub of lard. But with the women, they're exercising and healthy eating is more of a middle class thing. So these women are just going to be a little bit plumper. I know it's like people are like going to get mad about this. Like, you're hating our good conservative women. And it's like, I'm not quite. I'm just saying, pointing out things out. I wish they weren't like this, but this is in a lot of ways like this. And also, a lot of these women are just not going to be into your history and politics or reading. A lot of these people are like, reading? That's gay. So, I mean, you're going to also have to deal with that as well, is the IQ gap. And that's going to be your social milieu and your culture if you turn to these jobs. I mean, you may have like different interests from a lot of these people, and you may maintain that. But for the majority of the people you're going to be working with, and the majority of women that you're going to be going on dates with or possibly marrying, this is your social class. These are people who will defend pit bulls to the death and like talk about all the great tattoos and stuff. And if you like tattoos, and I can't defend liking pit bulls, but I'll defend liking tattoos. If that's your thing, then that's your thing. But I think for the majority of the people, and I can clearly see this by the way we post on Twitter, and also the fact that like most of right wing Twitter hates pit bulls, is like I can always say that that's like a real thing that distinguishes us from downscale whites, is that the pit bull question. But all this stuff is very subjective. I mean, it's different tastes, different strokes for different folks. And I'm just saying that like this is how it is. Some people are fine with these attributes, and I want to take back some of the working class white fascination with pit bulls. I don't think they're all into pit bulls, but they're much more into pit bulls than the middle class. I mean, there are some like awfuls who are very pro pit bull. So maybe the pit bull question or love goes all ways. But I would just say like pit bulls, like liking pit bulls is such a major red flag in my book. Like if you just like pit bulls, I'm like, that says just like a lot to me, that I'm like, okay, this is very informative. But going on forward, I mean, a lot of this stuff is just nitpicking and just like saying, well, you may make more money here, etc. The real question is like a major task for us is trying to construct a counter elite. And maybe this is a little too, maybe people might say this is a little fantastical and whatever. It's not necessarily a formal counter elite where we're like setting a group. It's like the new aristocracy and stuff. It's more of just an informal way where we're telling people to like, you need to be gaining influence and money. So, when the time comes where there's changes, we're in a position where we have people who are experienced, who have the resources to now lead. And this is what happened in the Soviet Union. If you guys listen to this Fall of the Soviet Union podcast, I talked about this, is that the people running Russia now were not people out homesteading and being plumbers and HVAC repairmen. Some of these guys had very humble origins. But what they tried to do is they tried to build money influence. And also they were already trying to influence the system and power structures that existed in the late Soviet Union. I mean, now what you have with Vladimir Putin is like all these guys are like ex-KGB guys or people who are taller to the intelligence services. And that is now formed part of the counter elite, is that this was an institution that was not in direct control. The party was the real controlling apparatus in the Soviet Union. The KGB was a secondary control, but it was like it did have the potential to be the new elite, to be the new leadership caste, and they were waiting in the wings, and now they're effectively running the country, a lot of those guys. And it's the same with like even these guys who built oligarchs. Now the oligarchs aren't in control, but these were guys who were already at the time in the Soviet Union were becoming entrepreneurs and figuring out ways to find advantages within the system and use the system to their own advantage and build up wealth and power. And then when the Soviet Union fell, these guys had a ton of power and were able to dictate decisions. They were not out being in the rural areas being plumbers. Now, there was one person, I'm not trying to highlight too many of my critics. They're very vicious and stuff. I mean, there was a lot of ridiculous claims. There was a guy who claimed that hedge fund managers were begging him to work for $10 an hour in the 2008 recession for construction jobs, which construction was harder hit than hedge fund managers in the 2008 recession. And I don't think there's any hedge fund manager who goes from like making at least six figures, if not seven figures a year, to making $10 an hour just to survive. I don't think that there was many cases of that. But people are just like promoting fantasies. The weirdest fantasy I had is that there was one guy who kept repeating this, and a lot of people were retweeting this as smart advice, is that the reason why we need to go into trades is he kept saying something that Tony Montana says from Scarface. It's like, first you get the money, then you get the power, then you get the women. And that's how America works. And it's like, well, you get a solid income with being a trade, but I don't know what power you get. And the guy would just like go to like, well, unions and stuff. It's like, well, you're not individually in power. It's just your union. And as you highly respected listeners should know, unions aren't necessarily our friends, even some of the blue collar ones. And we shouldn't hope that like unions are going to be our avenue for power. It's not like a plumber goes around and is a millionaire and he's got politicians in his pocket, which this guy was claiming it is. He's like, actually, yeah, plumbers can become millionaires. It's like, there was also some claim where some guy was like saying like, I know 3 kids in high school who instead of going to college now got trades. And they're each going into jobs that are starting at $200K a year. It's like, what? Like corporate lawyers don't even start at $200K a year. I mean, not even like guys going to Merrill Lynch or whatever, the main financial firms, like start making $200K a year. They may make around that. And it's like, no guy goes like an untrained novice, like a tradesman goes in and starts making $200K a year. But this is like this type of fantasy is that first you get, and like Tony Montana in the movie did not say that when he was about to go get his plumbing license. He said that as he's about to build a drug empire. Now, of course, I don't recommend building a drug empire, but that is a type of entrepreneurship that he's discussing. He's wanting to build his own empire through, his own initiative and independence so he can gain money, power, and women. And that's, you going into trade, that can give you a solid income and you can live the life you want, but that's like very different from becoming, a billionaire or a millionaire or certainly not a drug kingpin. And that's not necessarily the way to go about it. I mean, I don't necessarily recommend everyone become an entrepreneur because not everyone can be, but that's like the real way to gain money and power. If you're a very entrepreneurial person, you love, you've got a salesmanship quality to you, then more power to you. Like, be an entrepreneur. But for a lot of people, that's not an option. So if you're really talking about gaining power and influence, a lot of it is going to require a job or a college degree. And I don't necessarily understand this idea that like the plumber option that I talk about is that if we all become tradesmen, we then secretly run society and we can take it over. And really, it's more the opposite case. As I keep saying, it's like becoming dhimmis. It's like proletarianizing ourselves, where we're excluded from colleges and universities and the elite jobs and law firms and finance firms and all these things that like drive American society. But instead, we're fixing the liberal elites' toilets and their heating and air conditioning systems. But some ways that is the real, we now have power in society. Now, in some ways you may have some degree of independence. You might not have to deal with HR or whatever. That's fine. But I think as a people, that does not give us power and independence. Maybe on an individual level, when it comes to like, you can make politically incorrect jokes at work and you don't have to worry about getting fired, or you can make your own hours. Yeah, that is that. But as like a people, we're not setting our own hours or setting what our cultural standards or what policies are. Our enemies are, and they're the ones dominating society. And there was like this disturbing trend where they looked at the political affiliation of students at the top universities in America. And pretty much every university with a few exceptions, it was like 85 to 90%. It really actually 90% Democrat and only a minority of Republicans. And people were just like, all right, this rules. Bugmen alert. The bugmen are there. And it's like, no, this is really bad. This is meaning the people who are going to be justices, the people who are going to be running major law firms, finance firms, cultural institutions, the city government, federal government, all like anything that is dealing with like society at the elite level and institutional level is all going to be in the hands of our enemy. And they're, when it comes time to dictating social attitudes, they're the ones in control of TV shows and movies and other cultural institutions and the universities. And we're just looking at that and like, who cares? We're all going to be welders. And it's like through welders we'll have a mass amount of cultural and financial power. And that's just silly. That's just not the case. And looking at that, the solution is we're not going to win over those 90% of people and they're suddenly going to become Republicans. But we do need to win over more of the elites and people who are potential elites and college students and these people living in suburbanites. You just can't exclude them and just hope that all of our hopes are placed on non-college educated whites and the rural areas. As I keep saying, is that the number of young people in that category is continuing to dwindle, especially in the rural areas and among non-college educated whites. We're banking on a revolution among the old people, not the young people. And there are a lot of problems with these egghead elites and liberal elites and stuff, but we do need more of our own people in there and to convert some of them. We're not going to convert the majority of them. We're not going to immediately switch it from 90% Democrat to 90% Republican. It probably won't even be 60% Democrat, 40% Republican. But maybe we could switch it to at least a quarter or a third of them are Republicans. And generally those people who are going to be a hardened. That in some ways is a more revolutionary class because those are people who deal with persecution and deal with being outsiders among the elite, and that they have values and positions that are driven by opposition to their values and ideas, and they're more dedicated to it than probably the average liberal and more willing to want to change the world because they see the outrageousness of those around them. And they have a harder shell around them by being a minority. And you could see that as much more of a revolutionary class potential than you could see among, guys out in rural America who maybe aren't dealing with these issues and their main concerns is just what is in front of their front lawn. While guys and maybe Republicans are conservatives at elite universities who see this stuff firsthand, see the next leaders of America and are horrified and want to change that, are going to be more dedicated to quote unquote revolutionaries. And I'm not actually talking about a former revolutionary, but I'm just talking about it like a dedicated political fighter, I guess, that is going to be into that. And I think a lot of the ones who are there, who are going to elite institutions, who are still voting Republican and have conservative positions, are probably much more radicalized than maybe a lot of your average rural Americans. I think a lot of the kids in rural America are still very conservative, but maybe they're just like, nonchalant about it. It's just the way things life are. But these guys are very actively right wing. And I've get a lot of people tell me that a lot of these Federalist societies now at elite universities are very, very right wing now, while 10 years ago they were basically liberals. So there's like a change in that, and that's like a good thing. But we really do need the high IQ elites on our side. That shouldn't be our entire focus, and we can't just build an entire society around corporate lawyers or whatever. Everyone understands that. But you do need that counter elite there for when changes happen or we do get power, we have people in place who can make those changes happen and direct society. And those people are not going to be kids in trade schools who then live out in middle of nowhere America. Those people can make some difference, and they can maybe control their local township. Like one strategy I want to say is that that is good. That some of these people who are not necessarily critics, but were slightly disagreeing with it, few of the people were respectfully disagreeing with me. They were talking about how Guys in rural places should actively try to take over their local and state apparatuses, maybe not state apparatus, but local and county apparatuses to ensure their values are respected. And those can have an effect. Like there have been many cases of where a state government passes like a mask mandate or whatever, or tries to enforce some gun law, and then the counties are like, no, we're not enforcing that. And that's a real sign of power that you can do. That's a healthy thing. But that's not the entire solution, because ultimately these places, if at the national level, at the social wide level, is totally opposed to you guys, and the culture itself is poisonous, because rural America is not immune from this culture. These kids also are on TikTok and Instagram as well as anybody, and they're watching the same movies and music as anybody, as other kids. They're going to be infected with that same poison as elsewhere. And you can only prevent that from a lot of that stuff is by competing for power on a national level and even at an international level. You can't just wall yourself off from the world. Now, there are positive things that you can do, and support people who actually try to do this. But it's not only can you, if you have local power, you can also influence who becomes your next congressman as well. And that congressman could make an effect on national level. But the point I want to make there is that you still have to compete on national power. Like retreating to rural America and just hoping that your little enclave can be immune from the rest of the world is not the case. And you may want to point out the Amish. Well, the Amish are completely harmless. The Amish are not wanting to take over the country. They're just there. They're maintaining their, curious lifestyle, and that's it. But they're not like a power base. It's not a source of challenge or threat to the system. And they basically are able to survive by showing how harmless they are, which a lot of these people who are saying that we should do this want to directly announce that they're a threat to the system. And the reason why they're doing this is that they think it's going to be a threat to the system. And I want to make something clear, is that there's no real escape from the system. The only escape is to win. The only escape is victory. And I want to point this out, is that a lot of the guys who are arguing with me insist that they're, the plumber option is immune from the disorders that will happen. Some people say that they can withstand a recession, and some of these trade jobs, they're pretty recession proof. But a lot of the trade jobs are dependent on construction, and construction is one of the most devastated industries by a recession. A numerous amount of people depend on construction to exist to make money. And if there's, no money to be had to build construction, there's going to be no jobs for them. And a lot of the people that are most harmed by recessions are a lot of these blue collar skilled laborers. It's not recession proof. And when it goes further into imagining that rural America is going to be immune to a collapse, and that anyone can just grow all their products on their farm, and all their mechanic and tractors and its supplies can be made locally, that is just like completely silly. Is that rural America is just as dependent on the chain supply as elsewhere. There's maybe a potential that these guys could come together and try to make ends meet through a collapse, but a collapse would be, they may be able to survive, but it's such a massive drop in quality of life. Well, all these guys are like, no drop in quality of life. Meanwhile, like the suburbs and cities are all starving to death. And it's like, no, that's not going to be the case. It's like these people are going to be just as devastated elsewhere. They may be able to find some food, but it's not going to be it's not an autarky, which all these people think rural America is an autarky, where like all their supplies are local, all their food comes from local. No, most of them get their food from Walmart. Most of their supplies are imported. Like, this is not a self-sufficient region. They're just as dependent as elsewhere. So I think that like trying to seal yourself off and hoping that a collapse is going to happen. And I don't believe a collapse is going to happen. I think we're seeing, the American empire is pretty resilient, and the type of like American empire going from first world country to Mad Max overnight is just not going to happen. And that's what a lot of people's like collapse ideas say. And then they'll try to say like, no. When we mean collapse, we mean recession. A recession did not mean the end of American empire. It just mean a lot of these guys who thought that they were going to withstand a collapse are now like losing their jobs and having less work to do and having fewer job options, because a recession also hurts these blue collar skilled laborers as much as anybody else, if not more so. So the plumber option does not protect you from the same catastrophes and potential crises that'll affect everyone else. This has been a long topic, but I want to conclude on something that is like very disturbing about this. Regardless of whatever job you want to do, more power to you. Find what you like. Find that it's going to provide a stable income and allow you to live the life that you want and be around the people you want to be around and have the family you want to have. That's my main advice on that. But if you are a young college kid or who's like thinking about going to college and very into reading and very into like books and kind of nerdier stuff, I recommend going to college and trying to find a career path where it's going to be a white collar path. Now, if you're one of these kids who's likes working with their hands, hates school, doesn't want to go to college, or even if they're in college, they're like, this is stupid, I don't really like this, then, drop out and find a trade that you will enjoy. There's many different paths, but I think as I want to say, the greater point is what we're wanting to emphasize, that we do need to create a counter elite. It's not going to be necessarily formal and stuff, but we do need to have entryism where people get into these institutions. It's not even to the level of being like GOP and, like getting involved in that. Like that gives you actually power and influence to try to change the world. And even when it comes to blue collar professions, like law enforcement is a very influential position, and you're likely to meet a lot of like-minded people. And it is pretty recession proof, even though it's not necessarily social disorder proof, as like a lot of these guys got defunded. But it's like fairly recession proof, much more so than construction. I mean, yeah, they can have budget cuts, but a lot of people, during recession, they're worried more about crime and they want to make sure the police are getting paid. So there are a lot of avenues to explore, but we are a tiny minority and we're trying to create the building blocks for a foundation for when change happens. We have people in place who can run things, and we don't have to rely on our enemies to do these things. And we have the power. We're on top, not our enemies. We're not a Dalit class who has proletarianized herself, that is allowing Indian liberals to lord over us and demand they fix their toilets. I think that it's like a nightmare scenario, but for some reason people think that this is the path to power. It's not. But for some people it's a good advice, but for all of us it's not. And to think that this is like the real power political strategy is stupid. But going back to my point, where it's one thing, the final thing I want to say is like a disturbing trend about this is that a lot of the people pushing this, it is a quasi-Marxist idea that they're pushing about the class politics and class warfare and urban versus rural and death to urbanites and imagining the rural class as proletariat. And one of the people pushing this is Malcolm Kiyuni. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but we're going to call him Tingsor, who is this half Swedish, half African guy with a massive afro who dresses very metrosexually, and he lives in Sweden and he works for a think tank. And he has no connection at all with rural Americans. He kept calling me an urbanite bugman who lives close to a Shake Shack and stuff. And it's like, whatever. And this guy is a self-described Marxist. And the way he looks at rural Americans is in the same way that Sartre and all these other leftist intellectuals during the Cold War looked at these third world movements, who they looked at these guys as like the authentic revolutionaries. Like they loved them as exotic. They're like, oh, these Vietnamese and these Cubans and these South Americans. Oh, look at how authentic they are. They're rising up against the capitalist order that I'm a part of. And they themselves felt as outsiders in their own countries. For a variety of reasons. And Tingsor obviously looks like an outsider in Sweden, and he upholds this American proletariat, this rural American from far away, where it's an exotic type of thing that he feels that these people are going to be used as the tools for his own little intellectual theories. And it's the same way with that. And the unfortunate aspect is that he's relying on a number of Americans to present this type of politics, which the dissident right wants to stress identity politics. I really want to say that we are about identity politics and culture war. Economics is secondary. I think people can have a variety of economic opinions, but our primary concerns are identity politics and culture war. These guys, I think that like some of his friends in the Good Old Boys, which is another podcast that I would describe these guys as safe anons, because unlike other anons, like the anons I have on my show, like Nigel Carlsbad, Nemitz, Blepsama, maybe Nightmare Vision, some of these other guys. Thomas 77's not really an anon, but guys like that. Is like a lot of those anons are, really addressing issues that deal and addressing taboos about race, about identity, about a lot of things that you're not allowed to discuss in polite company. And a lot of people who are face lords, I'm a face lord myself, are people from populist thing, know that they need to uphold certain anons to give themselves credibility. And they're like, oh, we love anons, we need them. But they really need to make sure that these anons aren't posting anything racist so they don't get canceled. So they need safe anons. And out comes these guys from the good old boys who, they just talk about class politics. They're just about class war. They're good old boys too. If you check out their podcast, they got opening screen. It's got Dale Earnhardt on there. They got country music playing. They open up beer cans on air. They present that authentic rural America proletariat that these populist type people who have no connection to really want to imagine as them representing. And it's the same way. It would be in the same way as like these left-wing Cold War intellectuals, fantasizing about Africans, and then the Africans come and present their tribal ways, and they're like, "Oh, this is so exotic." And that's in some ways what some of these guys who stress class politics over identity politics do. Now, the good old boys are fairly nice guys, or at least one of them, Bog Beef. I mean, I try to have a polite conversation with him, but he unfollowed me for some reason. But it's like, I don't mention any ill will toward him, but you do have to mention that these guys are like the safe anons, because there is this populist ink scheme where they want us to believe that economic populism is all that we're about, and we're engaged in class politics and class war. And Tink Zorg is a part of this magazine that I talked about last week of Compact. He's a contributor to it. And all these guys involved in Compact have no connection at all with middle America or with rural America. I mean, Sohrab Ahmari is not a middle American. He lives in New York City. Like, these guys, like, all of them live in urban areas. They're all bugmen. And yet they just pretend that they're the real working class and representing these people. And the fantasy that they have the same ideas as the working class is given to them by guys like the good old boys who be like, well, I agree with you. And they can pretend that they're actually representing the genuine proletariat and indulge in their fantasies with this. But I think it is very negative, because at the end of the day, we're not engaged in class warfare. We are not Marxists at all. Marxism is stupid. I want to emphasize this, that Marxism is very dumb. This is not coming from a boomer composition. It's just it's an anachronistic type of way of looking at the world. It's looking at the world through a lens that no longer exists. That's not the way the world works. We're not wanting to pit urbanites versus ruralites. We're not wanting to pit blue collar versus white collar. We're trying to unite people across classes, across regions, across living situations, to take back our country on behalf of the historic American people, on behalf of the true Americans, not the outsiders, not the USCNs, not the paper Americans, not our Brahmin elite that want to lord over us and would love nothing more than all of us to become plumbers and to be HVAC repairmen that they can call up and treat like slaves. I don't want that for our country. I want us to be in power. I want us to have people like us, an elite, who are making decisions, who have the same culture as us, who have the same values as us, who are dictating everything to the rest of the population. I want to live in a country that reflects my values and my people and my heritage. I do not want to live in a foreign country. I do not want to live where I'm treated as a slave and a proletariat and somebody who's just fit to do menial labor for a hostile elite. And that's really what my position is on this. And that, I don't necessarily think, I mean, maybe you could say that it's like a class politics, but I don't want to indulge in going too far with the class thing where it's like proletariat versus bourgeoisie. Most of our people are middle class. And a lot of our people are working class too. So I don't think we should not have a conflict over middle versus working class, rural versus urban. As I said, we should all be in this together to take back our country and see that there is a hostile elite among us, that some of them we do need to have turncoat elites. We do need a lot of turncoat elites for our side. And this is how every society functions. Even most revolutions, I don't think it's necessarily going to be a revolution of some sort, but even when revolutions happen, they rely on turncoat elites to keep things running. I mean, even the Bolsheviks had this. They had to get generals from the old Tsarist army and bureaucrats in the Tsarist regime to help them run things. And then when Stalin in the 30s, they unfortunately began killing them off. I don't think most people want to do that or anything. But I'm just illustrating that these people have power for a reason, and you do need to build a counter elite in order to help out the working class and the middle class Americans and just middle America in general, and to reshape our country in a more positive direction. You just can't pretend that this is only going to be a proletariat revolution. And even among the communists and socialists, they had people who, they had intellectuals and others who were carrying their message across the countries and across classes and around. You just can't simply have an entire movement built around one social demographic that is that's in a servile role to the elite. So that's my opinion on the plumber option. I think we need to. Not everybody's going to be trying to enter in the counter elite, especially people who are in this. We're going to have people from all skills, but really, when looking at a strategy, one of the things that we can do to save ourselves is to work on creating this counter elite, which can be at multiple levels. It can mean having power in a local county. It can mean having power at the state level. It can mean having power over one federal agency, or it can mean having power over a certain powerful institution in our country, or even taking over the GOP. It's multiple levels that need to be taking place. And I just think that that's a much better mindset to have than the escapist mindset that always dominates on the right. And as I want to always emphasize, there is no escape but victory. Now, that whole rant was longer than most shows, but I still have a few things to talk about before we go. And there are, of course, some cognitive elite questions. We've got 2 today. And as a reminder, you too can get the power to ask me questions if you sign up for the Cognitive Elite option at highly-respected.com or highly-respected.substack.com, and make sure to sign up for the IQ supplements while you're there. You can get a big brain and a 187 IQ just like me if you sign up for them. So the first question comes from Tim. He asks, Scott, what do you think about the French presidential election? Do you think Marine Le Pen can win? And this is a great question. As you guys know, the French election happened yesterday, and Marine Le Pen came in second, and they're now going to a runoff. And I think the one thing is, can Marine Le Pen... I'll go answer that question first before I want to talk about the French presidential election a little bit more. But can Marine Le Pen win? It's more likely than it was in 2017, but not... I don't think it's that likely. I think they're going to really turn the screws on her. She's doing very well in polls. There are a few polls that show her in a dead heat with Macron, which there were no polls in 2017 showing this. But there are a lot of circumstances working against her. I think the Russia situation is definitely not going to help her. I mean, Europe may not be eager for war, and they may want to have better relations with Putin. But seeing somebody who had to get a loan from Russia to run I think it was in the 2012 presidential campaign. I think that's going to dissuade some voters, unfortunately. But I don't know. She could still win. I think that there's a greater chance in 2017. I have a funny story. Is in 2017, I wrote some article about the French election for the Daily Caller, and then Fox News invited me to talk about the French presidential election. I don't know a single word of French. I've never been to France, and they invite me on, and I even having trouble pronouncing some of these names. I couldn't pronounce Mélenchon. I had somebody in the green room who was like, "It's Mélenchon, right?" And he's like, "Yeah, it's Mélenchon." I was like, "All right, I got the name." And then I went on, and then they're like, "You did a great job." I was like, "Yeah, I couldn't even pronounce this stuff." Shows you a lot about TV coverage and about the experts they have. That aside, with this presidential election, people are wondering why Le Pen is doing so well, and some people may say it's in our identity politics and our issues that it is this. In some ways, I hate to regret this. In some ways, it validates populist think's position about focusing on economic politics, or economic populism and class politics. Maybe not class politics, but and eschewing more of the culture and identity stuff. I mean, Marine Le Pen, National Front, and her new party, National Rally, have always depended on immigration as their core issue, but they've also been much more to the center or left center on economics, and they're to the left of Macron's left on economics when this comes to this. And Macron has implemented a bunch of austerity measures. He's been wanting to mandate higher work weeks and, raising the age of retirement. And that's not gone. That's not settled well with people. And France has a high youth unemployment rate. And that's why a lot of young people are supporting Marine Le Pen. To that, I think immigration definitely plays a role in it, and maybe there's some skepticism of NATO that plays a role with it, and this internationalism and globalism. But her main appeal that made her succeed over Zemmour was the economic populism. But this is just in unique conditions that are happening. We have a very different conditions in America where there is not this. The one thing I didn't necessarily point out is that the native-born working class is declining rapidly in America. A lot of the working class now is Hispanic and non-white in America. Like a lot of the white working class is declining. In France, they still have a high percentage of white working class with a strong identity, and their left-wing parties have died. All the major candidates were not representing a major party. The old center right party, which is now called the Republicans, they finished in a very distant place, and then the center left party has completely died, and they're just left with the four people that were there that were at the highest vote getters were. Macron, who represents the center party, he was from the center left party. Then there's Marine Le Pen, which National Front's been around for a while, but it's always been on the outside. Mélenchon, who was I think a part of the Communist Party, he's from the far left. He was not from one of the major parties. He's just his own personality. And then Zemmour, who is just running as an independent, even though he's trying to build his own party. That aside, it's worth talking about the difference between Zemmour and Le Pen. Zemmour had a very much of the focus that the dissident right has. Is you're focusing on identity politics and you're focusing on race and culture and identity. That is what your main focus on. And you're also trying to win over middle class. His supporters were much more middle class than Le Pen's. The New York Times had this big article. It's a very informative article about the differences between, or I always want to keep calling him Macron for some reason, Le Pen and Zemmour. And Zemmour's, more of his followers were working class or middle class, these yuppie types in boat shoes and button-up shirts, while Le Pen's followers are more working class, leather jackets and tattoos. And that's a difference, and that's due to a lot in part to their economics. I would say that doesn't necessarily translate over into America, because a lot of the people, even the working class people in these trades, have very libertarian economics. It's not like they're an urban proletariat that we have anymore. Much of the urban proletariat that we still have is a lot more non-white now than it was 50 or 60 years ago. So I don't necessarily argue for total libertarian politics, but I think the adopting Le Pen's politics and trying to bring them over to America would not work. And she's also trying to disavow racism. One thing that Zemmour has done is I think he's made Le Pen look much more moderate in comparison, and that has been a benefit to her. Now, over time, what is going to be the more predominant position, whether it's Zemmourism versus Le Penism? Zemmourism is a high IQ, intellectual case. Tucker, it's focused on identity and race and these big civilizational issues, versus a Le Penism, which is promising, these economic benefits and stuff. I think there's always going to be that conflict on the right. But in America, promising these ideas, you're not necessarily helping middle Americans who are our primary base. You're primarily helping out the non-white lumpen proletariat that is now, or the proletariat that is taking over in many of these places, especially if you're adopting pro-Amazon unionization and pro-Starbucks unionization. Amazon union workers are majority non-white, and every time that the conservatives try to pretend that they're white working class people, the actual evidence shows otherwise. And then the Starbucks baristas are actually the stereotype of what it will happen to you if you go to a college and go into debt and you can only work at Starbucks. And they're all like, they're definitely the demographic that Antifa and others recruit from. They're much, I would say, Starbucks people are much more lumpen bourgeoisie in certain respects. So a lot of these economic populist ideas are more about helping these people that are in politics a political enemy rather than helping out our own people. And a lot of these people care much more, while they may like that, like, oh, that's thanks for supporting our union, but we still think Black Lives Matter and that we still oppose the don't say gay bill in Florida. And so they would never come over to our side in the same way with France. It's very different political dynamics in France. But it is interesting that's happening. I think if, Macron was pursuing a different economic agenda, that maybe Zemmour would be the one going into a runoff. But right now, with him pursuing radical economic changes and social changes, that is upsetting a lot of people. A lot of these voters who would prefer a left-wing candidate are now just voting for Le Pen because they see Macron as like the libertarian candidate who's imposing these harsh changes on the rest of society. But so that's what's happening with France. I guess the one white pill in France is that 4 out of the 5 main candidates, including the one person from the center-right party that didn't do very well. I mean, Zemmour didn't do that well either. They both finished under 10%. And this even includes Macron, is that they all support immigration restriction to an extent. I know I like to say to an extent, but this applies to 4 of the 5 candidates. And 2 of them endorsed Great Replacement. The one person who did not endorse Great Replacement was Le Pen, because Le Pen is like much more optically conscious than Zemmour. And so that is like a white pill that and even like Macron sort of taps into that theory and mentality with his appeal. And he's supporting immigration restriction now too, unlike in 2017. So that is a sort of a white pill for some of our beliefs that now all the major candidates, except for Mélenchon, the leftists, supported immigration restriction. So we got one more kind of leak question before we go, and this one comes from Phil. He's like, Scott, what is your thoughts on Trump's Dr. Oz endorsement? And this is true. While everyone, dissident right Twitter was getting mad at me over my roll takes, the rest of MAGA Twitter was getting very mad over Trump endorsing Dr. Oz, the famous TV show doctor. I don't think this is that bad. I think people are getting mad about this because the opponent, McCormick, was paying a lot of MAGA Twitter to be on his side. And it's very weird that they're supporting this guy. Like, I kind of understand them getting upset about the Morgan Ortagus endorsement in the Tennessee congressional race against Robbie Starbuck. Robbie Starbuck is a MAGA personality. And he's friends with these guys. It makes sense that they all think that Robbie Starbuck should have been the one to get the endorsement. But Robbie Starbuck is not a serious candidate. He is not going to win that race, even if Trump endorsed him. And he's a dude running with a ponytail in a very affluent suburban area where they look down upon that type of hairstyle and lifestyle. And so he doesn't really have much of a chance. But in the Pennsylvania race, it doesn't make sense because they're all getting mad on behalf of this, on the sake of a strong George W. Bush guy who's a hedge fund manager and who has endorsed mass legal immigration in the past and wanted more immigration. And they're all pretending that this guy is MAGA versus Dr. Oz, which Dr. Oz is like a TV show host. He was loyal to Trump in 2016, when everyone else was calling Trump a fascist and a Nazi, especially in the cultural world. Dr. Oz had him on a show and declared his health great, and he's like, Trump is a great guy. And that was a very risky move to do that in the fall of 2016, but Dr. Oz did it, and he effectively endorsed him, and they've been close friends for many years, and so he's of course going to endorse his friend. And the other guy sucks, and Dr. Oz doesn't have any strong political opinions. Some people talked about his trans stuff or the systemic racism. This guy will change all of his politics to fit the mold of the Republican Party. If he just needs to hire guys who support immigration restriction and know the score about what's going on in America, and he'll probably be one of the better senators there. I trust him more than I do some of these guys like McCormick, and I think a lot of these people are mad just because the opponent was paying them to hate on Dr. Oz. I don't want to say that about everyone, but I know that guy, the opponent, was for a fact like throwing money around MAGA Twitter, and thus this explains a lot of the outrage. Out of all of Trump's endorsements, this isn't that big of a thing. All these people should have been mad about Trump rescinding his endorsement of Mo Brooks in Alabama, but not a single person said a damn thing about that, even though Mo Brooks is a die-hard, loyal conservative who's totally on board with every MAGA thing. But for some reason, they didn't care about this issue, but they're getting really mad about the Dr. Oz endorsement. And I only have to say, likely scenario might be money at play, because anytime you see MAGA Twitter or conservative Twitter getting really hyped up about a minor issue, you have to wonder, is somebody getting paid here? Like when they're all like talking about the threat posed to America by Qatar, that was being pushed by Saudi lobbyists. And that's why a lot of MAGA Twitter was very focused on Qatar for in 2018 and 2019. I think Saudi Arabia stopped paying them, so they stopped talking about Qatar. But so that's something to keep in mind. The Dr. Oz endorsement, I think it's kind of funny. I think Dr. Oz will be good content as a senator. He can't be any worse than Mitt Romney, Murkowski, or Susan Collins, or Lindsey Graham, or any of these other people who are there already. He'll be fine, and he'll win. Like, everyone loves Dr. Oz, except for apparently conservatives. I mean, my mom likes Dr. Oz. Not a huge fan, but I know she sometimes used to watch Dr. Oz. So it's whatever. I don't think it's that big of a deal. I think it's more funny, and I hope Dr. Oz provides some good content. And that is it for this episode today. I hope I got you guys red-pilled on the Plumber Option, and we now are going to think about things more constructively and stop living in fantasy world. So until next time, stay respected.